In this, I give my early impressions and review of the MozArt Komorebi 40 color tin watercolor pan set. These are full pans. It includes 6 neons, which are definitely fugitive, and it includes 8 metallics. They are Japanese style, highly pigmented artist quality watercolors that are a very low price. They were purchased for me for my birthday, and I know they were less than 25 Canadian dollars altogether, which is quite a bargain for this much paint. I decided to take out the swatch card that does come with it on a decent paper, which is nice, except I decided that I wanted to be able to use the tin lid to mix paints. I'm testing out all the colors in their original order here, just on part of a sketchbook page, so I can rearrange the order to a color order I'd prefer that is more functionally useful for me. As you can see, I'm just testing out all the paints and swatching them in this book in order to get a look at what they look like, so I can properly test what color hue they are to arrange them in a better order. Having trouble with a couple colors, I put them on the edge of papers and took out these ASO cards I had cut so I could check them right up against orange, yellow, and blue. That way I could distinguish in some of the greens, browns, blues, and turquoisey colors which way they leaned and get everything in a more correct color order. I put the neons in with the non-neon colors and arranged everything more in rainbow order, having the metallics below. I'll ask you to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell if you're really enjoying my content. Later I'm going to put different paints in this tin and take out those metallics. Here I make these swatches. I'm making 2 sets so that one can go up in the window for year-long light fastness tests. I absolutely expect all the neon colors to completely fade, but let's see how quickly they fade. I won't be using the neon colors in any art that's for sale or for giving away unless I'm going to extremely warn the people that that will fade, or most likely I simply won't be using them. But I'd like to check the other colors. And it was actually easier for me to do all the colors in the order I put them in than to try to skip out the neons. After all, one set of these I was keeping for my own reference. As you can see, I made a couple mistakes, but that's okay because I can still see what's going on. I put the colors on the side that I put in slightly the wrong spot or that I forgot. It turned out the one I made for the window was actually more accurately correct. I came back after so I could switch the water to a different jar I use for metallic paints. It's tricky. I do gotta start mixing metallic paints in with non-metallics, but I'm a little scared to get that shimmer in there when I don't want to, so I gotta use a separate palette and a jar. The jar you can see here is the one I always use for metallic paints. I let it settle at the bottom and I dump out most of the water and I scrape off the metallic and I reuse it. I actually save the metallics in a separate jar until I get enough. Here's when I come back to it after I'd put the other paints I'm going to be keeping in the tin in here. So there's some gouache in here, some white, and some colors that are mostly white with a bit of tint added, and my Shinhan SWC set that I got as well. I'm doing these paint circles where you show a gradation from one color to the next, and it shows off a lot of these colors very nicely, and it shows how they mix together and some of the colors they can mix. I chose the colors intentionally and tried to pick ones that I thought would be interesting together on each individual wheel, and I'm making doubles here so that I can give some away as a gift. There was no pigment information made available, so the light fastness tests are actually extremely important in this case, so I can know whether or not I can use this for art I'm going to sell. Actually, I'm probably going to give away art using these paints and with neons, as long as I warn the people that these sort of paints may fade. After all, not everything is meant to last forever. As you can see, the gradation between the colors is less extreme on colors that are more similar to each other and more extreme on colors that are more different from each other. Sometimes you discover beautiful mixes you weren't expecting by doing these sort of tests, and other times it's really predictable, but it's still beautiful to see. I highly recommend making books of these sort of things, these palette circles that show the way the colors mix, or just lines that show the different colors mixing that you can refer to later, as well as keeping swatches like the ones I made earlier in order to literally refer to when you're painting. The other thing I suggest is redoing swatches if you're unhappy with them. The swatch page I did earlier that had the 2 colors on the side that were messed up wasn't good enough, so I actually redid it off camera for the one I'm actually using that I keep in a page protector. As you can see, I'm trying to get different colors in here, and between these 4 color wheels I'm showing, which is just I'm doing 2 that are identical every time, but 4 different palette circles, I'm making sure that there are no duplicates. So these are all different colors that I didn't use in a different one of these wheels. So I'm getting a good variety. I'm also trying to get a good variety of colors on each of these wheels in order to actually get a good idea of how these things mix. It's really interesting actually doing the neon colors in with the regular wheels so you can actually see how they mix. I'm thinking about doing some neon mixes in particular to put up in the window for the tests. Now I go into my sketchbook. This is a Talon's art creation sketchbook, which I love, and I'm using the paints themselves. As you can see, I'm doing some Permian predators. This up here is a Dimetrodon. Dimetrodon's an early synapsid. It's actually more of a mammal-like reptile, not a full normal reptile like most people would think. There's also Evontosaurus, which is a Gorgonopsid, which is also a synapsid, which is much closer related to ancestral mammals, and Helicoprion, which is an extinct shark relative that had a sort of a buzzsaw blade in the jaw. I'm not completely happy with the version of the paleo reconstruction I did of Helicoprion. I've seen some other reconstructions I actually like better that would fit the jaw into the upper jaw of the animal better now that I look back on it, but it's still a decent reconstruction of an extinct animal. So these are just 3 little paleo arts I did quickly. I only used the Komorebi paints for these, other than the fact that they were drawn out with colored pencils. Different pencil crayons were used to draw the outlines for them. I'm coming back in after letting it dry, so every time it fades and then fades back in, that's because I let it completely dry before coming back in. You always want to remember to let layers completely dry, especially if you need to paint right up against where you were just painting, or the wet paint will bleed into the new area, and you don't usually want that unless that's the effect you're going for. As you can see, I'm adding additional depth by layering these paints. The type of paper in here can be used with watercolor, even though it's quite thin, and it has an off-white cream hue, and I absolutely love these sketchbooks as well. And I think that it works really good with these paints in particular. But these paints work different on different papers. I just showed, these are the final swatches that I did. These are some studies I did of rocks and a black and white digital painting I printed out. And this is a sketchbook where I worked out everything about this Lapan, or rabbit person adventurer, riding on a Saltosaurus. The final artwork has a slightly different composition than the one I worked out in my other sketchbook, and I tested out and worked out the exact colors and things I was going to use, and I ended up using that Talon's art creation sketchbook again. I tested out this paint on many different papers, and it works very differently on different papers. I'll be adding more paper test results and information about which papers I think are better or worse in the description. If I continue doing tests and I remember, I'll come back and update the description of the video in order to include information about which papers I think work better or worse with these paints. Keeping in mind I'm a weirdo who forces paints to work on paper that's inappropriate for it, and that I think it's actually fine as long as you change your technique, but there are certain paints that work better or worse on different paper types, and I feel like it's useful to see which techniques and paint types work better or worse on different papers, based on also the way you paint. Sometimes it's better to do one sudden layer on certain paper, and sometimes you can actually layer. And other times you have to be careful because the layer underneath will pick up easily. This is also affected by the way the pigment itself works and the type of paint. If you're like me and don't necessarily want to follow the rules and would rather use cheap papers very often and force them to work with watercolors, not giving much of a care if things warp at all, but enjoying making lots of paintings, including in sketchbooks that aren't even intended for watercolor, then these paints in particular I think work well for that, and I hope that helps some people who paint in ways like me. Typically, white is not necessarily recommended, but I do like sometimes to use white to get things a little more opaque, to get things to flow, and to get that pastel look. Sometimes I feel like more opaque watercolors look more solid, and I actually sometimes want that look. I also like to use gouache and watercolor together and try out lots of different things and break some of the standard quote-unquote rules that you're supposed to do for watercolor. So my opinions are more based on that and based on how the paint looks and feels on the paper, but you have to remember that your technique and art style might vary greatly from mine, so it still might be that you would like it to get really pale on a certain paper. And maybe you would like to use these paints on that paper because you want the final artwork to look quite pale and washed out. There's not just one right way to do art, there's lots of different ways. I think I'll tell you a little bit about the lore of these characters and the world they come from now, rather than just focusing all on the paints. Lapin is my word for rabbit people. A ranger and a merchant, Camare Violante is an adventurer who lives on Alpha Vetar, my main world. I haven't filled in every detail, but I actually think he might be from more of the ancient past than the current timeline. He's from Kisarivel, which is sometimes also called Central. It's a country on the continent of Soralanus. This area is primarily plains, grassland, scrub, savanna, desert, and some forest. There's also a lot of underground areas as well, but there aren't any huge lakes. Although there are many rivers and streams and such, there's also, as I said, underground water reservoirs as well, and some underground worlds and places. But there are absolutely no mountains within visual range. Alpha Vetar itself is larger than Earth, although it has comparable Earth gravity due to its ancient magic that keeps the gravity similar to Earth. So you really can't see to the mountains anywhere on this country because of how large the entire planet's surface is. I found that was interesting because when I was figuring out what I was going to do for the composition of this artwork, originally planning to make it much larger, but deciding on using this sketchbook for the final art because I like the way this paper worked with this paint, it's really hard to make a good, somewhat landscape-based composition without mountains. Almost every single landscape artist I was studying and looking at and doing things from, they love to have mountains in absolutely every landscape, but there's no mountains here. And I decided that I'd rather zoom in a little more on the figures because he's already going to be so small here that I can barely get the details in and paint him. It does allow me to use some very fine brushes. I find the very fine point brushes really useful when you're painting small, and I find I end up painting small more often than I end up painting large because it does save money to use paper to make smaller compositions and to use sketchbooks and to paint and work small. Some additional lore is that this is his Saltosaurus mount. Saltosaurs are a native species to this area of the world, and the continent of Soralanus has dinosaurs as well as mammals living side by side, and this place is one of the homelands of the Lapin, or the rabbit people, on this world. Saltosaurus is a real extinct animal from our world, a dinosaur from the late Cretaceous, a armored-backed titanosaurid, and it was about 40 feet long. It lived in Argentina, that's where the fossils were found, and it was a plant-eating sauropod, long-necked, long-tailed dinosaur. So I'm going to make some effort this year, especially to put more effort into filling out my main world of Alpha Vetar a little bit more. I'm doing a lot of layering and finding that works fine. The part of the reason I did this painting was to test the ability to do full artworks with this paint, and I was also testing out, in particular, its layering capabilities, which I thought were quite fine on this particular paper. And I'm going to do some other tests on some other paper and add a few more notes in the description. Once I post this video, I'll have the notes written down so I can type them in the description when I post it. And I also noticed that this is an additional way of me testing this sketchbook. So this is a recent sketchbook I got, the Talons Art Creation, and I absolutely love it. And I'm finding it to be one of the best papers I think I've ever used, even though it's on the less expensive side. So I can't recommend it highly enough. As for this paint, I can recommend them as a good option for getting a lot of practice in because they're inexpensive, especially if you're practicing brush strokes and such. But it very much depends on the paper you're using and your preferences as a watercolorist, whether or not you'll actually like these paints, because I noticed I would not have liked them or recommended them if I'd only tried them out on that other paper, because I would have found that they didn't work well on that paper. So once again, as I always say, I do highly recommend you have to do different paper tests and you have to keep paper test notes just to see how things work on different surfaces, because it does vary quite extremely sometimes. I did a few additional tests before finishing this voiceover, but I only did them on paper I'd already tested. I noticed it works on every cheap paper I test extremely well. It actually tends to layer well and work better and stay a little brighter. However, the mid-range papers, so all the cellulose official watercolor papers, it works terribly on in my opinion, including the North Shore Cold Press, 140 pound, the 90 pound Artist Loft watercolor paper, and the Canson XL 140 pound paper, because it varies in brightness on these different papers, but it layers terribly on these papers. The previous layers lift back up and the colors blend together very easily, so you'd have to be very delicate in order to layer, and even then it wouldn't work very well. In particular, the North Shore paper I think is really bad, but I think that it works good on expensive cotton paper and very cheap non-watercolor paper, but doesn't work good on mid-range cellulose. Once again, that's all for this video. If you like my videos, please remember to like, subscribe, and turn on that notification bell to all notifications so you will know when a new video comes up. I aim for new videos every Wednesday, but sometimes life happens and things are delayed. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you with another one very soon.